So we're going to talk today about the mini research proposal, which is really a 1 to 2 page summary of your research. Although this will apply to any mini research proposal, I've aligned this with the outline of proposed research, which is the term used for the mini research proposal for both CIHR and NSERC CGS-M. So that's the Master's CIHR and CGS-D awards. And then also for the NSERC Doctoral awards, the CGS-D and actually the PGS-D as well. And with the CIHR Doctoral awards, this is called the Research Project Summary. But again, it's really about a really kind of condensed and mini overview of your research, of all the different facets of your research, but in a really condensed version. So this is just a copy of the instructions for the Masters, so the CGS-M for both CIHR and NSERC. At the Master's level, the CIHR and NSERC have the same instructions for the one-page research proposal. These are the instructions for the CIHR Doctoral Award, so that's the CGS-D, which they again call the Research Project Summary. And then lastly, for the NSERC CGS-D and also actually the PGS-D, because it's the same application, this is termed also the outline of proposed research, but in this case, the major difference between the other ones is that the NSERC Doctoral Awards allows for a 2-page summary. Regardless of whether or not you're applying for CIHR or NSERC or for at the master's level or doctoral level, I recommend to use very specific headings to address the description of these for these proposals. And those specific headings are background, objectives, methods, and significance. And these are headings we also use in larger grants, but of course you can see I've selected these headings because it closely matches the description, and this is a good technique in general. Even if specific headings aren't required, it's good to match the headings with the description of the piece. So here you can see, for example, it says state the objectives and hypothesis. I've mixed the background information, the experimental or theoretical approach, which is the methodology, and then the methods and procedures to be used, and state the significance of the proposed research. The CIHR CGS-D gives a little bit kind of less information, but the NSERC CGS-D has almost the same kind of description as for the master's level. But regardless, I really recommend to use headings, and you can say background or introduction. You can use slightly different terms, but I recommend these general headings. And this is a sample research proposal here. And you can see these specific headings in terms of, again, background, objective, methods, and then also significance here. A couple things to note here. Normally, if I had more space, if it wasn't a 1 or 2 page proposal, I would probably put space between the background section and the methods, and then I wouldn't need to indent. That should be an arrow, and I wouldn't need to indent them. But with limited space, I usually recommend to just instead of using spacing between, just to indent them. But again, I sometimes see these it's just all one solid page of text. That's really hard for the eye. It's really hard on the reader. So even just having a little bit of delineation with some bolding and then some indentation is really important. It also really helps to guide the reader to say, okay, this background information is here. You don't have to kind of search for that information. So that's also really helpful. In terms of suggested space, I get a lot of questions about how much time should I devote to my background section or my objective or methods or the significance section. I generally suggest that you can see here in the example, most of the text is devoted to the background information and the methods, and then I would say a sort of small paragraph for the objective and the significance. And this can vary slightly depending on, if you have a lot of, for example, if you're proposing a lot of kind of different types of methods, that you might shorten the background information a little bit and expand on the methods, that's totally fine. But I would say just in general, roughly kind of a split such as this. And then now I'll talk a little bit about the specific sections within those subsections. So for the background, The first part of the background is really just about general information about usually in health research, you're talking about some kind of condition or disease, or on the kind of more NSERC side of more kind of discovery science, the sort of the biological context being studied. I always recommend if you're writing at a Canadian institution or for a Canadian funding agency to include, if they're available, some Canadian statistics, especially if it's about a health condition. And really, the purpose of the background information to me, it's really the rationale that that explains why the study is being conducted. And what is really, I think, really vital is to be able to articulate is the knowledge gap. And this is really important to say, what is the gap in knowledge that's going to lead to why the objectives, that it builds up to the objectives. And it's important to be really as specific as possible. Sometimes I see studies that say, there is a dearth of evidence in cardiovascular spinal cord injury physiology research. Okay, I understand. Okay, maybe there's not a lot done in there, but you need to be a little bit more specific to tell me what specifically do some of the major studies lack, or some of the kind of related studies, what specifically do they lack? So in terms of an example, you can see here at the beginning part of my introduction section or the background section, there's a little bit just in general about this research is about spinal cord injury and cardiovascular disease. And this is a human health project. So we can see at the top of the background section, we have just a little bit general about spinal cord injury, a little bit about the basic epidemiology. Then you can see the next section gets a little bit more specific. We're now talking about, a specific aspect of spinal cord injury, in this case, autonomic dysfunction, so things affecting the heart and vasculature. And then you can see it leads down eventually to this part in green, which is the knowledge gap. So in this case, it said, referring to a study that has previously been published. The study was cross-sectional and did not examine the timing of onset of heart disease. And you can see here, this is very explicit. It says, it is therefore unknown that blank. In this case, it is therefore not known when heart disease arises after injury and or if this risk is amplified relative to the general population. Obviously, you will have a specific and very different knowledge gap, but I think it's really nice to just spell out exactly for the reader, especially with a multidisciplinary panel who may not be familiar with this type of research, exactly what is unknown. So I always use this phrase in my grants with proposals, with scholarship applications. It is therefore unknown that blank. And then, as I say, this leads nicely to the objective section. So the next section after the background section, your mini proposal may have it may have multiple objectives. The number of objectives really depends on the time frame you have for your MSc or PhD, and that this really ties into the concept of feasibility. So I really recommend, oftentimes when we're writing mini research proposals, it's embedded within, say, your supervisor's project. And that's of course totally valid, but what I recommend is don't just copy the objectives, say, from a larger grant that your supervisor has applied for or was successful with, because generally grants are much larger projects in which your smaller project is embedded. So I really recommend having a discussion about with your supervisor or with your peers who have done some of these maybe techniques or used some of these data sources before, to, really don't just copy the objectives, really make sure you've got a feasible number of objectives and the techniques involved in those objectives are feasible for an MSc or a PhD. And also keep in mind, for an MSc, for example, in Canada, typically a lot of the MSc, the early part of the MSc is based on coursework, and then although some research might be being conducted, it's not, full-on research. So it's really a really short time frame. So feasibility is really important there. And then, of course, for a PhD as well, which tends to be a little bit longer. But regardless, feasibility really needs to, when you're considering the objectives, really think about that concept of feasibility. And we'll come back to the concept of feasibility again. As I mentioned before, the objectives flow naturally from your knowledge gap. So it is unknown that, therefore we are going to examine, or the study aims to examine, or therefore I will examine blank. That's really important. From the objectives naturally flow from the knowledge gap. I also, in some of the instructions you see for the CGS-M, for example, so that's the master's regardless of whether or not it's CIHR or NSERC, to include the hypothesis here. I typically recommend, because in your full thesis proposal, if you're writing a 10-page thesis proposal, you will write probably a hypothesis for each of your objectives. In this case here, because it's more limited, I typically recommend to write at least a hypothesis for the primary kind of main objectives, and then as I say, leave it out for the purpose of a more condensed proposal in your full thesis proposal. The CGS-D and the CGS-D awards do not explicitly mention hypotheses, so it's not required. However, it never hurts to also include a hypothesis if you do have space for that. But it's sort of more optional for the CGS-D aspects. So here's an example for objectives. So this again is related to the same. This is an extension of the example I showed before. So it mentioned in the background, we mentioned the knowledge gap, and then my objectives now say, to address this knowledge gap, my aims are to blank. In this case, 1, to determine the timing of onset of heart disease after a spinal cord injury, and 2, to evaluate the risk of heart disease in individuals with spinal cord injury relative to the general population. So in this case, it has 2 objectives, but as I said before, you might have 1 objective, you might have 4 objectives. It really depends on what is feasible and how ambitious you want to be. And then the method section. So again, we have the background and the objectives, and then the methods, which really answers the question of how will you carry out the proposed objectives. So this will include information on the study design, whether or not it's observational or experimental, and if it is observational, the specific kind of subtype of observational study, cross-sectional or cohort studies, case control studies, or experimental, more details about the randomization procedures and the time course for data collection and so on. And then also in this section, we'll identify the outcomes and explanatory variables, or in other disciplines we call this the dependent and independent variables. That's really important to specify here, and also how these, of course, will be obtained, right? So if I'm looking at if my outcome variable is some kind of, let's say, an imaging biomarker or some kind of blood biomarker, or you might also be obtaining data from surveys or from health records, how these will be obtained, and then also the data types for these outcomes. So if they're treated as kind of continuous variables, or if you're going to convert a continuous variable into a binary variable. Oftentimes for the explanatory or the independent variable in health research, we're often looking at treatment groups, which they may have multiple levels, but it's a single explanatory variable. And then we also want to specify typically we specify the planned sample size, and then also a data analysis section. And within the method section, right, this in a 1 to 2 page proposal, this is going to be really brief. It will be 1 or 2 sentences. In your full thesis proposal, this will take up, a much larger kind of paragraph. This is really just a really brief data analysis section, and usually just kind of for the main portion of the analysis. So what specific technique you're using. Are you using t-tests, ANOVA, linear regression, logistic regression, survival analysis, and so on? I really recommend for the methods that they really be in the same. It's really important in these. Flow is really important, I think, in all writing, and certainly important here. And one thing that I find helps with flow and scientific research is to keep everything in the same order. So if, for example, you have, let's say, 1, 2, 3 objectives, then you can also order the method section in the same order as those objectives. And, later on, outside of this proposal, when you're writing results and discussion, if you keep that order, it really, really helps the reader. So again, keep the methods in the same order as the objectives. If you have some pieces that might be, let's say, a common technique to one or more objectives, that's totally fine. You might introduce that kind of at the top or at the bottom. But if you have different techniques or different methods for different objectives, I think it's important to keep that order. The method section is written in future tense. For master, at the master's and doctoral level, for regardless NSERC or CIHR, I recommend doing in first person. And the reason that is because it actually relates to the second point here, or sorry, to the other point here, in terms of what your role in the study is. So if you say, I will do this, I will then do that, and X, I will do that, it's totally fine. I see lots of these mini proposals where where the person writes we, or sometimes in a passive tense, like microscopy will be performed. That's totally fine. But in general, I find because you're kind of showing what you're gonna do, you want to show off what you're gonna do, it makes sense, I think, to use the first person here. So that's typically what I recommend. And then it really easily follows to say your specific role in that. When you're saying I will do this and then I will do that, it's generally pretty clear what your role is. And then also in the method section, feasibility, I mentioned before, it's such a big, important topic in grant proposals, in scholarship applications. Feasibility is a really, really big, you'll see it on most award criteria or grant criteria, feasibility. And sometimes if you had a lot of space, I would probably have a separate section on feasibility, just a small section, but it would be a separate section. Because I think you're limited in space, I recommend you can just include a sentence or two about feasibility in the method section. And feasibility, I think it's actually fairly straightforward to demonstrate. I think a few things, for example, one is that you have certain equipment, just that equipment is available. So you have your method section, you describe, I'm using confocal microscopy, or I'm using population data, that you have. It's easy just to say these equipment are all available in the laboratory of so-and-so, or these data are available through my supervisor. It's also important, I think, part of feasibility too is not just equipment, but also expertise. So my supervisor is an expert in this area, or we have a relevant collaboration. Maybe your supervisor doesn't have this specific technique or data access or subject knowledge, but we are collaborating, for example. So for example, in our work, we do a lot of research that may have applications in clinical settings. So I would always mention collaborations with physiotherapists or other clinicians, in our case, surgeons, and so on. And then lastly, for feasibility, training in techniques or methods. So any prior training that you've done in that, it's a little bit of a balance, right? Because you want to make sure that your part of training, right, is of course learning new methods, but you also want to demonstrate feasibility. So I think saying that you have training in at least in some of these methods, these techniques, is important to say. And here's an example for methods. So you can see the first part of this methods talks really about the study design and some of the outcome measures. And then you'll see the statistical analysis section is, I'm really big on statistical analyses, but even here, right, it's just a really one sentence to describe kind of the main analysis. And then you can see here, I put in italics the role, and then as well the feasibility statement. And again, these could be other sections, but I think that it works well with limited space to include your role in the study and the feasibility within the method section. Okay, and then the last section is the impact statement. So this is really important section, and it's really answered the question kind of, why does this work matter? One of my old mentors used to say, so what, now what? So what are we going to do with this information? And now how should people react to this work? What should they do with this information? And who does this matter to? Does it matter to clinicians? Does it matter to policymakers? Will it affect drug labeling? Why does this work matter? It's important here to be genuine. Sometimes I think we can get into a space of maybe overextending what the implications of our work. So it's important to be genuine. And I think it's also important. Novelty and impact, I think, are somewhat intertwined. So again, just like I said, let's spell out the knowledge gap in the introduction section. It's also important to spell out the novelty of the project. And then lastly, it's really important to specify the Canadian context as well when you're writing from a Canadian institution or for a Canadian granting agency. And if you're writing, or if you're writing a similar proposal for an organization based in the US, for example, I would say you put the US context just to kind of really spell home that you are taking Canadians, for example, into consideration here. So this is an example of an impact statement. So you can see it starts off again, just spells it out. This work is novel because of blank. And then you can see the impact is that, so in this case, my work in this field will inform targeted treatment and prevention strategies for individuals with spinal cord injury, in turn improving the lives of Canadians affected by spinal cord injury. So you can see where I've inserted really to drive home the point that it will improve, in this case, health of individuals with spinal cord injury. Yes, hopefully this work will help all individuals globally with spinal cord injury, but again, Canadian funding agency, it's nice to really drive home the Canadian context. So those are the main sections. I'll now just kind of go over a few tips in general for writing a mini 1 to 2 page research proposal. The first is really to write for a general scientific audience, especially for CIHR and NSERC. These are multidisciplinary committees, and typically what happens is the committee reviews it at a unit, so say a department or faculty level, then it typically goes off to sort of a university-wide competition, and then to a national competition. So at all those levels, there are typically many different scientific disciplines involved. So I always say a general scientific audience, so someone who has a training in science but is not necessarily an expertise in that area. So in that sense, it's really helpful to have a peer, maybe in someone that also works in science but in a really different area to review. So if you work, for example, if you do lab-based research, to have someone who works maybe in kind of more population health and vice versa, so that they can kind of, especially sometimes, the method section might get a little bit technical, but in general, like the introduction section, the objectives and the impact should really be understood by any scientist. And honestly, especially the impact statement, even kind of a layperson should really understand that piece. The second is to limit the use of abbreviations. So this is of course kind of up to you to use your judgment on this, but for me, in my writing, I basically have done away with abbreviations completely in grant applications, in publications, in scholarship applications. And the reason why is that abbreviations, there's actually empirical evidence on studies. So studies actually showing that people, even trained scientists, they can't hold that many abbreviations in their head. And when you think about it, it relates to the first point in terms of writing for a general scientific audience, is people outside of a certain field, when they're not used to reading those specific abbreviations, they don't connect what they stand for. So it really actually hinders the readability of applications. I know when you say, oh, I've only got 1 to 2 pages, that's really difficult. But I think what you'll find is if you if you write out the abbreviation in full, so for example, one abbreviation we commonly use is SCI for spinal cord injury. What you find is if you write out in spinal cord injury, with spinal cord injury, after spinal cord injury, what you find is you can actually, you don't have to keep repeating it. Once you've kind of mentioned the context of spinal cord injury, that's actually implied. So you don't have to keep repeating that. So that will actually save you the text, as opposed to using the abbreviation, which in theory saves text. So again, a bit controversial, obviously up to you. And there are obviously some very standard abbreviations, like for example, CNS for central nervous system. That's totally fine. But really, for kind of really niche abbreviations, I would strongly recommend limiting them. And then other tips in terms of first person, I mentioned this before, but so this is in future tense, but I think for trainee, at the trainee level, it's totally fine. If not, it actually, as I mentioned before, it makes sense to use first person language. And then lastly, so I've talked mainly kind of about the focus on the 1-page research proposal and sections. If you are writing for a 2-page research proposal, you can add in other sections because you have the space for it, right? You can add in a section on study strengths, study limitations. I typically put study strength and limitations. You can put it in one section or sort of a combined section or separate, but I typically put this after the methods. For 2-page proposal, also, if you have space, you can include kind of a mini timeline for your project. But I always recommend to end on an impact statement. I find it very climactic. You read this, really nice proposal, and then it ends on something like the limitations of the study or a timeline, very anticlimactic. So I always recommend, if you have these, still keep the impact statement at the end to really end on that high note of why your research matters. And then, of course, also in a 2-page proposal, you can expand. You have more room to expand on the introduction and the method sections. Another kind of point, sort of a tip, is about images. So images, everyone has different feelings about using images, especially in brief research, right? When you only have 1 to 2 pages to commit your work. Of course, images and figures, they take up space, but they do add a lot of interest. If you think about when these proposals are read, they're often read very, very quickly. So, for example, without even reading the text here, you can see, okay, this has something to do with the brain and spinal cord, and looks like something to do with the heart as well. So I think they add kind of that visual interest and really just kind of drive home the point about what this kind of research is about. So I recommend to kind of see, is your picture really worth 1,000 words, or at least is your picture worth the space it takes up? That's kind of my recommendation. And I typically actually tend to use them, even though they take up space for the reasons I mentioned before. And the images, they can be used either in the background, so some important background information, or they can also be used in the method section, right? If you have a very complex study design that has lots of different types of endpoints and lots of different time points and different, say, study groups, for example, an image or figure is totally valid to use in the method section as well. It's also a place where you could put preliminary data. So, for example, in the background section where you're mentioning your rationale, a knowledge gap might be, okay, prior studies have done this, work that I have previously done or that my supervisor has done has shown this, and then you might have a figure for that, a really, just a small figure for that specific, that can also help with identifying the knowledge gap, and again adds some interest if you have some really cool microscopy. I'm always jealous of some of the basic science who have these really cool imaging, microscopy, some electrophysiological tracings, some neat sort of behavioral data, or some in vivo data and so on. In vitro data or in vivo data. If you have something that I think sort of that shows interest, I think that's totally valid to include, even in a brief proposal. Just, of course, if you're using published work, of course, just remember to cite that, or if you're using published images to cite that work. Or if you're using something unpublished, say preliminary data, you can just in a brief figure legend, you could just write that it's unpublished. Okay, so those are kind of the main kind of sections I recommend and kind of components of those sections. I just wanted to talk about two more ideas briefly. So one is how you get started with your research proposal. So with your mini proposal. So the main thing really is to start with what I recommend is really just to start with your knowledge gap, right? When you're a trainee when you maybe don't have quite as much experience in research, identifying a knowledge gap is actually really, really difficult to do, right? You're identifying a new study that you can do. That's actually really hard to do. That takes years to understand the field and to understand what's already been. You have to have a major knowledge of what's already been done, and then to understand what's actually missing from there. So what I really recommend is to have a discussion with your supervisor. Can you articulate in one sentence what is the knowledge in prior work that we're trying to fill? What is the knowledge gap? And to articulate that one sentence for your introduction or your background section to say, it is not known blank. And again, something very specific that is unknown. A literature search obviously helps with this, and sometimes you might do a combination of literature search and discussion with your supervisor. But really, I think just starting with, what is the gap that what is the knowledge gap that my research will fill is a great place to start. Once you have that, right, even that one sentence then leads naturally to those objectives, right? And then that leads directly to your method section. In general, it's also right for a brief research proposal, 1 to 2 page proposal. It's also really helpful to look at similar studies published in the area, especially the abstracts. So the abstracts are of course what has been done. So in past tense, and you're writing a proposal, which is in future tense, what you will do. But oftentimes these are really nice places that have summarized a lot of complex methods in a really small amount of space. So they're very helpful for also, designing your method, for articulating your method section as well. And then lastly, for the bibliography, I have a few suggestions for this. So the bibliography is quite different depending on whether it's a CIHR, CGS-D, CIHR, CGS-M, NSERC CGS-M, or NSERC CGS-D. But in general, I suggest using a superscript notation or square brackets for the in-text citation, so like this. And then, I'm not writing very well, not writing very clear. Square brackets like here. And then just a note, so hundreds of references are obviously not necessarily and certainly not feasible within the space requirements. For the CIHR, CGS-D especially, the references are actually included in the one page, right? That's really, really small. So I suggest for that, when you don't, for the other ones where you have a separate attachment for the bibliography, then you can certainly include more references. You don't need to fill the page with unnecessary references. You certainly want to make sure that they are actually relevant to your text. But for the CHR CGS-D, I suggest really like 4 or 5, maybe 10 maximum references, and then you can use the PMID, so that's the PubMed ID or any other unique identifier, and you can just separate them by semicolons, right? So you have your in-text citation here, and then the PMID for the first one, for the second one, third one, and so on. And having the PMIDs is totally fine way to do that when you have such limited space. If you don't have limited space, of course you include the complete citation, right? The title, journal, volume, issue, and page numbers, and so on. But again, if you have limited space, you can get a little bit creative in terms of how you show the references. One point about the bibliography is this is actually a commonplace. We often use referencing software, right, to create a bibliography. But often there are actually little mistakes that come out in the bibliography. So one major one that I've noticed is consistent formatting. So sometimes you'll look through it and say in one random reference, all the authors' names are capitalized for some reason, or for some reason it's missing the page numbers, or it's missing journal name or something in one or two citations. So I really recommend, you won't have a ton of references, so really just edit the references, the bibliography, just like you would any other section that you would go through it with, with a bit of scrutiny, just to make sure they're consistently formatted, even if you're using an automated, which is supposed to kind of remove some of these errors. And then also to make sure that the citation matches the statement. So reference, if it's reference to, that you look back in the text, make sure, okay, yeah, this is the paper I meant to match that specific in-text citation, because oftentimes you kind of might rearrange it, but that's often a source in not just in proposals, but also in when you're actually writing up articles. That's a good tip as well, to actually look at and edit your bibliography as well.